Today's a story of a South Carolina flooding that completely overwhelmed the Charleston airport and several other coastal communities. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. It was an area of low pressure from days prior. It stalls out offshore. It drinks a healthy serving of Hurricane Joaquin. It was basically like hooking up a fire hose to a hydrant and then you just let her fly. And it was all over South Carolina. And it happened on October 2nd, 2015, this day in weather history. It was called a once-in-a-millennium event, and it wasn't even a hurricane. I mean, it was helped by a hurricane, but still, it affected the whole Atlantic seaboard, but South Carolina was by far hit the hardest. There was a cold front attached to an already healthy low-pressure system that was making its way across the southern plains towards the South Atlantic coast of the United States on September 29th through the 30th. Now, along its path, it had already established itself as a threat by producing heavy rain in multiple states. Then it just pulled up anchor and stalled offshore. This is where the South Carolina flood begins. You see, this October 2015 North American storm complex was extratropical in nature, and they always come with heavy rain and could have been enough for flooding to be an issue in the most affected regions, especially across North and South Carolina. But that's where things here just didn't end. This stalled out low reached out into the Atlantic Ocean and, in its counter-clockwise low-pressure spin, inadvertently tapped into moisture from the nearby Hurricane Joaquin. This brought a deluge of continuous rain to southeastern states, with the worst effects concentrated in South Carolina where the catastrophic flooding occurred. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, but oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Check out some of these numbers. An area known as Boone Hall, by the 4th of October, had been inundated by 615 millimeters of rain. And in just one day, Charleston Airport was leveled with almost 300 millimeters of rain. By October 3rd, 500 traffic accidents and the Charleston Historic District was brought to a virtual standstill while most roads were closed due to the flooding. But it was on October 4th when enough was finally enough. It was when the rivers burst their banks. All a result of this inundation of rain, stalled low, offshore hurricane. The state's Department of Health and Environment Control said 36 dams had indeed failed. Therefore, this massive onslaught of water washed out roads, bridges, vehicles, and homes. Saturated soils, along with moderate to strong winds, contributed to downed trees and power line poles across portions of South Carolina. About 50,000 residents lost power at the height of the storm. Fortunately, power was restored to all customers by the 6th. The October 2015 floods severely impacted safety, life, and the livelihood of those in South Carolina. Several of the fatalities were individuals trapped in vehicles, swept into high water. One woman drowned in Spartanburg on October 1st after her car was overwhelmed by flooding in an underpass. Overall, this entire duration event resulted in 25 deaths, 19 of which were in South Carolina, caused by the flooding. There were 2 in New York, 1 in North Carolina, 1 in Florida, and 1 in New Brunswick. Total damage in dollars was pegged at $2 billion. And it was all due to a sequence of unfortunate meteorological events, a stalled out low that was in the perfect proximity to a passing hurricane that was just close enough to be tapped for an auxiliary moisture feed. Sometimes things just work out that way. And they did, unfortunately, for South Carolina on October 2nd of 2015, this day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is October 3rd, and we are looking ahead to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. And I take you back to where it all began and just how it got to where it is today. Now, I know you're going to find this story interesting, but some facts that played into its story date back as far as the founding fathers of the United States of America. So don't miss tomorrow, because it's going to be a celebration. It's going to be right here on this day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May.